A new report by an independent panel is highly critical of how Japan's leaders acted in the hours and days after the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. It calls their response off the cuff and too late. The 6 experts on the panel based their findings on interviews with 300 people, including top-ranking Japanese and American officials. They spent months studying the response to the Fukushima accident, which happened after last year's March 11th earthquake and tsunami. They tried to interview authorities at Tokyo Electric Power Company, the operator of the plant, but Tepco turned down their request.
The direct causes of the nuclear accident were the unpreparedness of Tokyo Electric Power for a serious accident and the government's lack of a sense of responsibility.
The report blames the government's response on its failure to anticipate the combined impact of a quake and a tsunami. That rendered this crisis management manual useless. The report says the problem was compounded by politicians' lack of basic legal knowledge. The document also points to delays in providing the Prime Minister's office with accurate information, as well as insufficient support by advisors. It urges immediate debate on improving the situation. The report condemns the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency for failing to give professionals proper safety training. It says the agencies could not draw up plans to put the Fukushima plant under control because of a lack of skill and personnel. The report blames Tepco for initially making things worse at the facility, not better. Tepco workers did not immediately switch to an alternative cooling system after realizing the emergency condenser was not working. Then, they took too long to start the venting procedure to avert a major crisis. The committee chairman says the investigation has revealed what was going inside the Prime Minister's office and elsewhere at the time of the accident. The chairman also says Japan's organizations are ill-prepared to deal with a crisis, a problem that needs to be fixed as soon as possible.
Let me see if I can compose myself after that.
Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda has instructed government ministers to work together so evacuees in Fukushima can return home as soon as possible. Noda spoke at an informal cabinet session on Tuesday. He said the government's top priority is to get people back home by speeding up decontamination work, infrastructure projects, and job creation measures. Reconstruction Minister Tatsuo Hirano said he has met with mayors from cities in the evacuation zones. He says the government is working with local authorities to oversee an intermediate storage facility for radioactive soil in Fukushima. Some 160,000 people in the area are still unable to return home. The government plans to review the borders of the evacuation zones by the end of March.
A separate investigation into the Fukushima meltdown has heard from a former U.S. nuclear regulatory chief. Richard Mers told the parliamentary panel that on-site experts should have the power to decide how to respond to an emergency situation at a plant. The former U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission chairman says there is still a lack of trust for the Japanese government and nuclear authorities, stemming from how they dealt with the accident.
In my view, the only way to correct that is to have the public have access to the information and know what's happening and why it's happening, and have the confidence that decisions are being made on a proper basis.
Meserve says it is important for nuclear regulatory organizations to be free from political intervention and independent of a power company. He adds regulatory body must listen to the public and maintain a high level of openness and transparency. Former Prime Minister Naoto Kan ordered Tokyo Electric Power Company to begin emergency procedures during the Fukushima accident. Meserve said it would be unthinkable in his country for that to be decided by the president rather than on-site experts.
An independent panel says then Prime Minister Naoto Kan did not know of a tool that might have helped in the aftermath of the March 11th disaster. SPEEDY is a computer system that can predict the spread of radioactive materials. Panel members say Kan and those around him did not know it even existed. The 6-member panel of experts is expected to issue its report on the disaster during the day. The report says Kan and 4 other politicians blame Science Ministry officials for not informing them about SPEEDY. The government developed the system with a budget of 12 billion yen, or roughly 150 million US dollars. Former Cabinet Secretary Yukio Edano said he found out about the system in a media report several days after the disaster. At the time, the plant's number 2 reactor was spewing radioactive materials. Edano said bureaucrats told him later that they had decided not to inform him about Speedy because its calculations were not credible. They cited a lack of precise data on radiation. The panel charges in its report that Speedy was used as a tool to assure local residents about the safety of nuclear power and to obtain their consent to build the plant. The report also says the system should have been used more effectively to reduce residents' exposure to radiation as much as possible.
The report also revealed that the government ignored the advice of U.S. authorities and failed to refer to U.S. nuclear safety guidelines. The independent panel says after 9/11, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, established guidelines for restoring nuclear reactors disabled by a terrorist attack. The panel says the U.S. Commission explained the guidelines to Japan's Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency on at least 2 occasions. The NRC also asked Japan to improve the anti-terrorism measures at its nuclear facilities. But the independent panel says the agency did not adopt the recommended safety measures. The investigators say that if the guidelines had been followed, the damage at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant would have been less severe.
An independent investigative panel report says members of Japan's cabinet braced for an evacuation of Tokyo after the Fukushima nuclear accident. The 6-member expert panel is to issue a report on Tuesday based on interviews with 300 Japanese and U.S. government officials and others about their responses to the accident on March 11th last year. The report says the chief of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant informed the government 3 days after the accident that nuclear fuel rods there could melt because of cooling system failures. The information was reportedly sent to cabinet members and nuclear experts. Economy Minister Yukio Edano was the chief cabinet secretary at the time and served as the government's spokesperson. Edano says in the report that in the worst-case scenario, if the fuel rods continue to be exposed to the air, a large dose of radioactive material could have been released and prevented workers from entering reactor buildings. Edano says he feared that problems could also occur at another nuclear plant in Fukushima and that Tokyo might have to be evacuated. He adds the cabinet was told of this scenario, but that the government chose not to make it public. The report stresses the need for discussions on information disclosure by the government during emergencies. Japan's Agriculture Ministry has decided to conditionally allow rice planting in some areas where unsafe levels of radiation were detected last year. Local governments are to make sure that the crops will not be distributed if such high levels are found again. The ministry drew up new standards on Tuesday for rice planting after the government tightened its safety standards for food to 100 becquerels per kilogram starting in April. The ministry says that farmers will be banned from planting rice where more than 500 becquerels per kilogram radioactive substances were detected in rice harvested last year. In areas where between 100 and 500 becquerels per kilogram were detected in last season's rice, planting will also be banned in principle. But farmers in those areas will be allowed to plant rice if they agree to the condition that municipalities monitor production in each field and all harvested rice is checked for radiation before shipment. The plan comes in response to calls from farmers in Fukushima Prefecture saying that stricter rice planting restrictions would cause more people to give up farming at a time when the farming population is aging.
Rice with readings of more than 100 becquerels will not be distributed. To enforce such a system, we need to work closely with local governments.
The ministry aims to hear from local governments by early March on whether they will opt for a total ban or follow the conditional permission scheme. The government panel has proposed setting up 2 separate facilities to help local communities respond to future nuclear crises. This comes after an off-site emergency response center failed to function properly during the Fukushima meltdown. Rising levels of radiation and the impact of the earthquake and tsunami prevented local officials from gathering at the center about 5 kilometers away from the Fukushima plant. A working panel of the Nuclear Safety Commission submitted a list of recommendations on Tuesday. It proposes reinforcing the emergency response system by creating 2 separate facilities. One would serve as a nerve center to give local residents information and evacuation instructions. It would be set up in the prefectural office building sufficiently away from the plant to avoid the risk of radiation. The second center would serve as a front base to monitor radiation levels and conduct evacuations. The government will set new national guidelines following the panel's final recommendations due out early March.
Well, cover-up, confusion and a lack of trust. Those are the findings of a new report due out shortly into Japan's handling of its nuclear power plant crisis last year. The Fukushima site was badly damaged after last year's earthquake. The 9-magnitude quake struck on March the 11th and killed around 15,000 people. The report paints a troubling picture of the events during a meltdown catastrophe that spiraled out of control. The investigation damns the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the then Prime Minister Naoto Kan, and slams the communication between all the parties in the wake of the disaster. I'll straight now to Al Jazeera's Steve Chow, who's on the phone for us from Fukushima. Steve, a damning report.
Well, very much so. This 400-page report offers a harsh condemnation of not only the government mishandling of the crisis, but also the mishandling of the crisis by the company that oversees the Fukushima nuclear plant known as Tepco. Now, one of the key points out of this report is the fact that during the height of the nuclear meltdown, Japan's political leaders, we understand, were making decisions essentially in the dark. They were not being given the proper information as to the extent of the damage of the nuclear reactors at that time. That raises many troubling questions. It raises questions as to exactly whether the public was actually getting the information they needed to know what was safe and what was not, and where the radiation ultimately was traveling. We were here in the initial days last March, when this crisis was unfolding, and a lot of the public here in Fukushima was deeply concerned about exactly what was happening. They were very upset, feeling that the government was simply not giving them timely information. This report says that their concerns were in fact founded. There are a lot of allegations in this report that Tepco was in fact covering up the extent of the damage, and ultimately it may have affected hundreds of thousands of people's lives here in this region.
And Steve, Tepco refused to cooperate with the investigators, didn't they?
Well, that's right. We understand that the 30 investigators that were part of this committee that conducted this 6-month investigation, in fact, requested from Tepco to have interviews with leading officials. They were repeatedly denied. But we understand that in all, they interviewed 300 people, including some Tepco workers outside of the plant, outside of the control, if you will, of this company, and they offered a lot of insights into this. Some other concerns that come out of this is the fact that Japanese officials even considered possibly evacuating the entire populace of Tokyo simply because they did not know the scale of the nuclear meltdown. You have to recall at this point that during the height of this crisis, it was rated as a Category 7, equal to Chernobyl. But to this day, a lot of information simply is not known, specifically exactly how much radiation has been emitted by the Fukushima plant, how much has been sent into the atmosphere, how much was sent into the ocean, because it is right along the coast. There are also other troubling facts. The fact that the government ministries essentially had software to map the amount of radiation and the path of the radiation, but they simply did not share that with Japan's leaders. And it took an independent scientist weeks after this disaster to begin his own monitoring to tell the government that their 20-kilometer evacuation zone around the plant was simply not far enough and that the radiation had traveled many kilometers northwest of the Fukushima plant. So a lot of troubling questions will be raised following this release of this independent report, and many questions will be obviously directed towards the government here.
Lots of questions, like you said, Steve, and very quickly, it's highly unusual, isn't it, for such open criticism of the government in highly controlled Japan?
Well, that's right. Japan is, as you mentioned, highly controlled. It is very rare that we get this kind of insight and examination of the government handling of the situation as well as the handling of corporations. The very fact that this independent commission was started, the very fact that they were given the access that they did, suggests that there was a great deal of public mistrust and anger directed at the government and this company, which still exists very much today. We feel it when we're on the ground here. We've been here a couple of days now. We've been here repeatedly over the past year. And the constant message that we hear from the public is simply that they mistrust the government, they mistrust Tepco and their handling, and they believe they're still being lied to.